Welcome back. This is spring 2021, and it's the first lecture in our economics semester that we're doing. Today's lecture is on globalization and a little bit on the United Nations. It is a overview of globalization. Globalization is a very detailed and intricate idea and concept, as you will see from the reading that you have this week. My goal here is to just introduce you to the topic of globalization and some of the underlying principles of globalization. It is simply a beginning video on that, so I would watch this video and start reading your packet on globalization. So let's start with what it is. This is a very brief definition. It is a process of interaction between people, businesses, and government. So process is the key here. It is something that's been around forever. Since we began civilizations, we began globalization. It's not a static idea. It impacts economics. It impacts culture and society and social values. It impacts politics and governance. So globalization, the reason it's so complicated is because it impacts so many different areas. So you have to kind of ask yourself, what motivates globalization? It's not a static thing. What motivated globalization in 1700 or 1600 was slave trade and colonization. Those things don't motivate us anymore. But what motivates us now? Economics, money, finance. So asking those questions about motivation are important. It's not good and it's not bad. Globalization itself is just a process. It's just what it is. And we'll talk more about that in the next slide, but globalization itself is not good or bad. It's been around, as I've said, for hundreds of years. It's not a new phenomenon. We've seen it in colonization. We've seen it in the slave trade. We've seen it when societies created monocultures. In other words, the United Kingdom would take over a country and force that country into growing one singular crop. They'd take over another country, and that country would grow another crop, so that all of the countries were dependent on England for distributing the crops, because you couldn't live on one crop alone. So that's what a monoculture is. Now we see in globalization this idea of technology and computers and high-speed internet, smartphones, really blowing up globalization in different ways, right? So not only does the device itself lend itself to globalization, and you can look at the Green Revolution in North Africa a few years ago, but the way the phone is put together is also a good indication of what globalization is. So, as I said, it's neither good nor bad, but the implementation of globalization has consequences. So how you implement that process, who is impacted by that process, and how you impact them, obviously can have good or bad consequences. So that's the distinction, right? It's about implementation. And so two of the words that you'll come across in your reading that I want to further talk about here are sensitivity and vulnerability. Sensitivity is, very briefly, one person, one country is responsive to changes or behaviors of another country or person as a result of the interconnectedness. So if we have a housing crisis in the United States, we're not buying lumber from Brazil, right? And so Brazil is sensitive to the United States housing crisis. Vulnerability is when a country is adversely affected by changes of decisions, behaviors, or other actors. And that would be the same kind of example. Our housing crisis has an impact on the Brazilian economy. The Brazilian economy is vulnerable to the U.S. housing crisis because they can't export wood to us. So these two words often kind of go symbiotically. They're often seen together. They don't have to be, but generally they are. If you're sensitive to another country, you're probably also vulnerable to that country. So those are some words you'll come across in your reading. It's helpful for us to keep those two in mind, because if we are being sensitive to and if we're paying attention to the policies that we make, if we're attuned to how other countries are connected to us, we can make policy that doesn't hurt other countries as much, right? We can try to be sensitive to the interworkings of other countries, and that's becomes really important as we talk about the United Nations later on. Is that part of the function of the United Nations was to try to help countries navigate that, thread that needle. So when we think about globalization, it's important that we understand certain ideas. Like, how do we discuss poverty? Well, in the United States, discussing poverty is very different than discussing poverty globally. How do we discuss healthcare? Again, discussing healthcare in the United States, very different than discussing healthcare globally. How do we discuss entrepreneurship in the United States? Very different than how we discuss it globally. How we discuss gender and women's issues, again, different in terms of domestic and foreign. And all of these questions, their answers are impacted and influenced by the new and not so new global world. So we're looking at all of these different things, whether it's healthcare or gender or women's issues, through a different lens. And that lens is changing even now. Just in the years I've been teaching, the lens has changed at least twice. And so the lens is always, the lens we use to look at the global world is always changing. And particularly with social media, it changes more and more rapidly. So I want to show you this website and kind of get your take on this and show you this. So I'm going to put in the average teacher salary for the United States. And let's just say this is a single person, a single woman who's a teacher in the United States, average salary. This is her average salary, $61,000 US. And then we're gonna just say that this single person, right, is richer than 99% of the world. You're in the richest 1% of the global population. Now, we will all say quickly that we don't want to be teachers because teachers don't get paid very much, right? Teachers are not highly paid, highly respected. Those jobs are not highly respected. And it can be seen in the pay that one gets from being a teacher. That is not a valued position. However, globally, a teacher in the United States making the average income would be in the top 1% richest people in the world. So just, again, how we view things matters. The lens through which we look at things matters, right? Here is, if we could donate, the distribution of 1,200 insecticide-treated bed nets, more than 6,000 treatments, of equivalent savings around 1.8 healthy lives. I mean, we could donate a substantial amount of things and really make a difference. Now, I'm just pointing that out to sort of say, that is certainly illustrative to say that a teacher makes, an average teacher salary is in the top 1%. If you look at the average salary for a surgeon, is $225,000, again, assuming that this woman lives on her own and no kids. You can sort of see, again, your income is more than 79 times the global median. If you were to donate 10% of your income, right, you would have a household income of $202,000, and you would make $22,000 in donations. And with that $22,000 in donations, you can see what would happen there. So again, when we talk about this is we're talking globally. In this month, as we talk about globalization, most of what we're talking about is global. I'm trying to illustrate a larger point here. The surgeons, obviously, we value, we say we pay them a lot, and you can see that reflected there. But here's the other one, and the last one I want to show you. If you're in Arkansas and you make the minimum wage and you work 52 weeks, 40 hours a week, you'll come up with $19,000. Now, all of us will quickly say that that person is poor. That person's living in poverty. And we would not be wrong from an American perspective. But if you make the minimum wage in the United States, in Arkansas specifically, you're in the richest 10% of the global population, meaning there are 90% of the people on this planet who make less than you. Your income is more than 6.8 times the global median. You could still donate 10% of your salary and accomplish all of these things here. So when we talk about poverty in the United States, it is a different kind of poverty. It's a different level of poverty. It is a poverty with a floor that is relatively high compared to the rest of the countries in the world. Our floor is not as high as it could be, but our floor is higher than almost 90% of the population. Okay, so I want to kind of paint that brush with a broad brush there to sort of show you that and get that kind of in your mind, that globally the conversations about poverty and income are very different than what they would be here in the United States. So kind of going along those same lines, what I'd like for you to do now is sort of just in your room or wherever you're watching this, think about these two questions. Why are people poor? Well, why people are poor, you might say they don't have a good education, they don't live in the right zip code, they don't have access to jobs or access to health care. These might be things that you say that why people are poor. And you're right. The things that why people are poor are systematic things. Access to poor schools, access to poor health care or no health care, living in conditions where infrastructure and public transportation are not happening, living on food deserts because grocery stores are not carrying the right types of foods or healthy foods. All of these things are systematic things. So when we talk about why are people poor, we talk about systems. But now here's the other thing. Now think about this question. What do people say about why people are poor? That's a different question. Think about what do people say about why people are poor? They're lazy. They're drug addicted. They don't care. They're apathetic. All of a sudden, we've gone from systems, which make people poor, and we've changed our language to attacking people. We've gone from systems to individuals, and in so doing, caused a rift in our understanding of the appropriate ways to solve poverty, because we jump from systems to individuals. And in that jump, we lose it, right? Instead of trying to fix the systems, we attack the person, right? And that is played out in politics, both domestically here in the United States, but also on an international level, right? When we talk about the countries that have made it and the countries that are struggling, listen to the way we describe those countries, right? First world countries, right? Third world countries, developing countries. The language matters. And so I want you to be aware of that and thoughtful about that as we think about poverty and global poverty in particular. Again, I want you to think about these 5 words, and I want you to think about your understanding of those words. And again, look at the word poverty. Well, you would say that the person in Arkansas making $19,000 a year is living in poverty. But with a global understanding, you just saw that that person is in the top 90%, top 10%. And so I think it's important to begin to differentiate these two things. Resources, accesses to resources. What kind of access to resources do people have? Right here, if you have access to phones and video games and Netflix and transportation, you have easy access to gas to fill up your car, you have access to healthcare, education, your resources are accessible. But when you think globally, how accessible are all of those resources in the various countries? And globalization, we tend to be thinking about globalization as on the receiving end. We get the smartphone. We get it when it's already made and packaged. We don't have to worry about where all the pieces are made and where they come from. Capitalism, again, is something that we look at here internally different than what we look at externally. And then we think about exploitation differently as well. And it's one thing to say we don't want any exploitation. We don't want to exploit anybody. We are above exploiting people. But if you begin to drill down, one of the books you're going to read later in this month is called Blood Oil, and it really does a good job of showing us just how deep you have to go and what you would have to do if you really wanted to avoid exploiting anybody, anywhere, at any time. If you really were above exploitation, it's darn near impossible to do that, to live a life free of exploitation, because of the way globalization has interconnected all of us. So what I want you to do, again, just wherever you're watching this video, what I want you to do is I want you to spend a few minutes just looking at your clothing, looking at your cell phone, your bags, your purses, your wallets, whatever you have access to. And I want you to just look where each of those things are made. Just kind of, again, this is just for your purposes. You're not turning this in, but just make a list. You're not turning it in, just kind of jot down so you can visualize it, that this was made in Venezuela, and this was made in Mexico, and this was made in China, and this was made in Poland, and this was made wherever. And I want you to sort of make that list and sort of see where things are made. And then ask yourself, for those things not made in the United States, why were they made overseas? Think about that question. Who profits from the objects being made, right? And then who suffers and who is exploited? And why do you think our economy is set up in a way that benefits one group or one actor over another? Again, you're not turning this in. This is simply a thought exercise. I'm trusting you to think about these questions, reflect on these questions, and we can talk about them on our Zoom later on. Okay, so now we're going to sort of pivot from that to the United Nations, because the United Nations came about in the late 40s after 2 world wars, and the purpose was to address some of these questions, right? Some of these things that I've been talking about throughout this lecture, the United Nations intention was to address this and try to find ways that we could be sensitive to other countries and keep them from being sort of vulnerable to fluctuations within other countries and to keep us uh, aware of our interconnectedness. That was really the intent of the United Nations. So it was established in October 45, trying to bring the world into dialogue and try to address this process of globalization. Um, to pass anything in the United Nations is very difficult because you need 2/3 of the countries assembled there, which I think is around 200 countries, and you'd have to have 2/3 of that to pass something. Well, the problem with that is that you have something called the Security Council, and it's 15 members. 5 of them are permanent. The other 10 rotate amongst the other 200 countries. The 5 permanent ones are China, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The reason it's those 5 countries is they were the first 5 countries to get nuclear weapons. It's that simple. It's not any more complicated than that. These 5 countries got nuclear weapons first. They were the big boys on the block. They set it up. They said, we're doing it. We're permanent. Also, each of those 5 countries has veto power over any piece of legislation. So, as you can imagine, Russia and the United States are not often on the same side. So, something Russia wants to pass, the U.S. is probably going to veto, and vice versa. So, this is why things are so complicated, is because of this Security Council that is set up to really be a check, but it has become not just a check, but it's become an impediment, a roadblock to things really getting accomplished. Um, so the United Nations consists of 17 agencies, and don't need to know all the 17 agencies, but they revolve around food and health and science and refugees and environment. I mean, these are kind of what the agencies deal with at different levels. Um, I've listed a couple here, but again, you don't need to necessarily know these. Now, this is something we're going to spend the next lecture on next week. It's called the Millennium Development Goals. So in the late 90s, the United Nations decided we are going to set out these 8 goals, and we're going to try to achieve them by 2015. And so the 8 goals were to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character. Those were what the goals were attempting to do. And we were going to talk about each one of these 8 in detail and kind of look at them over the course of the 15 years. So when the millennium hit in 2000, that's when they started working on these goals. And we're going to look at them in 2000, 2005, 2015. We're going to see the growth that has happened. They are eradicate extreme poverty, achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality and empower women, reduce child mortality rates, improve maternal health, reduce HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, ensure environmental sustainability, and form global partnerships for development. Those are the 8 goals. Like I said, we're going to look at each of the 8 next lecture, but this is one of those things that the United Nations put forth to try to achieve some level of cooperation and working together. And they were pretty successful on most of these goals. I think all of the goals had a measure of success. Some were more successful than others. So that will be the next lecture. I want you to please continue reading your packet or start reading your packet on globalization. We will have a Zoom later this week to answer questions about the packet, to answer questions about this lecture. And I will talk to you later this week during the Zoom.